Hey, it's Hex Harry and I'm here to make TTRPGs feel easy. So here's the deal. I love being in the moment with my players when we're playing a TTRPG. I'm not the type to play a game where my nose is buried in a rulebook the entire time, because I'd rather be in the moment and crack some jokes and have some fun and tell a story, rather than get super into nitty-gritty rules and all that kind of stuff. But the downside of just going with the flow and enjoying the moment is sometimes I forget stuff. Important stuff. The issue is I get so invested in the story, I forget to write things down, and it means that later on we'll get to a scene where we're meant to be visiting an NPC that I whipped out of thin air a couple of sessions ago, and I cannot remember his name, I don't remember how he sounds, I forgot why I created him, and all my players are expecting this cohesive, seamless world to flow into the next session, and I have no idea what I'm doing. This can break the illusion, as you can imagine, and makes me look like a bad GM. If the players get the impression that what you're working on wasn't pre-planned, is very improvised, and therefore doesn't hold any value, it can start to actually detract from the experience they're having because they feel like the world they're interacting with doesn't actually have consequences or meaning. This doesn't mean that everything has to feel super scripted and has its own place. It just means that there's ways we can increase the immersion for our players, and that involves writing stuff down sometimes. Also, setups with no payoffs. Nobody wants that. We want beautiful, cathartic moments that were established a couple sessions earlier and remembered by a GM that wrote stuff down. And you know what? Credit where credit's due. GMing can be a tough gig, and sometimes you're not thinking about future sessions when you're trying to just keep this single session afloat. But here are a couple of simple tools that I think can jump that gap and make sure that your sessions are even higher quality while you're still able to enjoy it with low effort. Firstly, less is best when it comes to note-taking. Our brain is really good at using a memorization technique called chunking, which means that seeing one key word or phrase can actually trigger the memory of several other related pieces of information. What this means is you don't need to write down every single little thing that your players are doing. All you need is a couple of key prompts to jog your memory for later that night or the next day when you're taking notes for the next session to come. You have a beautiful big brain in there, make the most of it. Work smarter, not harder. For example, if I come up with a dodgy merchant that's just sold the players some really important skateboard thing that's going to come back later on, and maybe the merchant's going to be relevant in a future episode, all I need to write down is maybe their name and the item. Since I don't interact with many people named Globberglob in real life, there's a good chance that it's going to prompt the memory of the session, a little bit of related info, and mean that I can refer back to it later on. I also find using different colored sticky notes for different items can be really handy too, like yellows for NPCs, pinks for plot points. I also think taking notes of key character moments from your players can also be really handy for powerful setups and payoffs later on. I remember in a campaign of Slug Blasters, one of our player characters tried to attempt a trick that they thought would be super easy, and they ended up failing hard. It was like trying to surf like a sand wave made of debris and metal and all that kind of stuff. And the player actually really lingered on that failure for the rest of the session in a way that felt organic and really interesting. Thankfully, I did think to write that one down, and it meant that a couple sessions later, I could actually serve up that trick again for them to have another attempt, and when they succeeded, you bet it paid off. I think this system works pretty well for me because it stops me from being fully distracted by the play that's happening. It doesn't feel like the players having their own conversation is like they're being babysat while I take notes and prep for later in the session. I can just spend a couple of seconds to jot something down and then put it away for later. But it does mean that there is long-term payoffs and value of that note-taking. Once again, less is best. And better yet, it makes session prep in the future quite a bit easier too. You just need to refer back to all those different sticky notes of NPCs to whip one out of the air and come up with some cool moment that will bring them back for the future episode. Even if it's small, it's this consistency that actually makes your world feel alive. So in summary, you don't need to write a novel, just a couple of quick notes will help you stop from being like this guy, a forgetful GM. Thanks for joining me today while I yap about my memory problems during a TTRPG session. If you like this sort of content, consider subscribing. I've got more videos like it coming out in a bit, where I talk about all sorts of lessons I've learned as a GM. Otherwise, thank you for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.